England, 1829. The morning mist lingered over the rolling grounds of Wycliffe Hall, painting the ancient stones with a spectral hush that seemed to mock the very notion of warmth. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, gossip travelled faster than the wind, and nowhere did it run more fiercely than when a heart of the aristocracy was at stake. I tell this tale not as one who merely heard it recounted in whispers behind silken fans, but as a voice who saw longing set fire to propriety and watched a single scandalous choice rattle the very bones of England's nobility. It began on a rain-washed Thursday in late April, when Alexander Pembroke, the 6th Duke of Ashcombe, proud, fiercely private, and England's finest bachelor, defied every law, every expectation, and every future laid at his well-shod feet. The matter at hand was not merely marriage, but the undoing of a royal engagement, one that would have united two houses and fortified the bonds between crown and country. Yet beneath the glitter of the court and the perfection of polished manners, destiny grows wild as bramble, and in its shadows toiled a girl the world wished to forget, Charlotte Hale, orphan, ward of a parish, unnoticed, almost invisible, but for the singular grace with which she carried sorrow on her slender shoulders. Alexander Pembroke had known duty since the day he drew his first breath in the east wing of Ashcombe Manor, a sprawling estate that stretched across 3 counties and bore witness to centuries of Pembroke dominion. His father, the 5th Duke, had been a man of iron will and frozen heart, a man who believed affection was weakness and love a liability. Alexander learned early to suppress warmth, to present a mask of indifference to the world, to cultivate a reputation for cold precision in business and unyielding control in matters of the heart. He was handsome, undeniably so, with dark hair that fell in waves across a broad forehead, eyes the colour of storm clouds over the North Sea, and a jaw carved with the sharpness of ancestral pride. Women of the ton pursued him with the desperation of hunters tracking rare game, yet he remained elusive, untouched, unmoved. Until the day the king himself summoned him to Carlton House and laid before him an offer impossible to refuse, marriage to Princess Amelia of Saxe-Weiden, a union that would cement England's alliance with the German states and elevate the Pembroke name to heights unimaginable. Alexander had accepted without hesitation, not from desire, but from duty. Princess Amelia was beautiful in the way porcelain dolls are beautiful, perfect, pristine, utterly lifeless. She smiled when required, spoke when prompted, and carried herself with the rigid formality of one trained from infancy to be ornamental rather than human. Alexander found her tolerable, which was more than he expected from any woman the crown might choose for him. The engagement was announced with great ceremony in the London Gazette, and society erupted in rapturous celebration. Balls were held in their honour, toasts raised to their future, and wagers placed on the number of heirs they would produce. Alexander played his part flawlessly, escorting Amelia through endless rounds of social obligations, his expression carefully neutral, his manners impeccable, his heart entirely untouched. It was on one such obligatory outing, a visit to the parish of St. Cuthbert's to distribute alms to the deserving poor, that Alexander first laid eyes on Charlotte Hale. The parish, located in the grim industrial outskirts of London, was a place of soot and suffering, where orphans and widows eked out existences in conditions that would horrify the pampered ladies of Mayfair. Alexander had come reluctantly, dragged along by Princess Amelia, whose advisers insisted such displays of charity would endear her to the English public. He stood in the cramped chapel, surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies and the muted whimpering of hungry children, his jaw tight with barely concealed distaste. Princess Amelia moved through the crowd with practiced grace, handing out bread and coins with a smile that never reached her eyes, while Alexander followed at a polite distance, counting the minutes until he could return to civilization. Then he saw her. Charlotte Hale knelt on the stone floor of the chapel, her thin frame bent over a child who had collapsed from fever. She wore a dress of faded grey wool, patched at the elbows and hem, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid that revealed the delicate lines of her face. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that should have drawn his attention, yet Alexander found himself unable to look away. It was the way she moved, the way she cradled the sick child with infinite tenderness, the way her lips moved in whispered reassurances, the way her eyes, dark and luminous, reflected a depth of compassion he had never witnessed in any woman of his acquaintance. She looked up suddenly, perhaps sensing his gaze, and their eyes met across the crowded chapel. For a single, suspended moment, the world fell silent. Alexander felt something shift within him, something he could not name, a sensation both foreign and terrifying. Princess Amelia's voice, shrill and imperious, shattered the moment. She demanded they leave at once, claiming the air was foul and the company beneath her dignity. Alexander tore his gaze from Charlotte and followed his future bride out into the rain-slicked streets, but the image of that girl, kneeling in the dirt with a dying child in her arms, remained burned into his mind. He told himself it was nothing, a fleeting curiosity, an aberration brought on by the dismal surroundings. He returned to his life of privilege and obligation, attending endless dinners and balls, signing contracts and negotiating settlements, preparing for a marriage that would be celebrated across 2 nations. Yet at night, when the candles were extinguished and silence settled over Ashcombe Manor, it was Charlotte's face he saw in the darkness, her eyes haunting him with their quiet strength. Weeks passed, and Alexander grew increasingly restless. He found himself making excuses to return to St. Cuthbert's parish, always under the pretense of charitable work, always accompanied by servants to maintain propriety. He told himself he was simply curious about the conditions of the poor, that his interest was purely philanthropic. But each time he visited, he sought her out, watching from a distance as she tended to the sick, taught letters to the orphans, distributed food to the starving. She moved through that wretched place like a beacon of light, her presence transforming squalor into something almost sacred. He learned her name from the parish priest, a kindly old man who spoke of Charlotte with deep affection. She was an orphan herself, the priest explained, born to a mother who had died in childbirth and a father who had perished at sea. She had been raised by the parish, given basic education by the nuns, and had chosen to remain at St. Cuthbert's to care for others rather than seek employment in service. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and gave everything she had to those even more unfortunate than herself. Alexander found himself inventing reasons to speak with her, engaging her in conversations about the needs of the parish, the health of the children, the challenges of securing adequate supplies. Charlotte was shy at first, clearly unaccustomed to attention from anyone, much less a duke. She answered his questions in a soft, measured voice, her gaze lowered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. But gradually, as his visits became more frequent, she began to relax in his presence. She spoke with quiet intelligence about the inequities of the poor laws, the desperate need for medical care, the hunger that gnawed at the bellies of children who had committed no sin other than being born into poverty. Alexander listened, truly listened, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life. He began to see the world through her eyes, to understand that nobility was not a matter of birth, but of character, that true grace resided not in ballrooms, but in acts of selfless compassion. It was during one of these visits, as autumn leaves swirled through the narrow streets and the first chill of winter crept into the air, that Alexander realized the full extent of his predicament. He was in love with Charlotte Hale. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and disoriented. He, who had prided himself on emotional detachment, who had accepted a loveless marriage with a royal princess without a moment's hesitation, had fallen irrevocably, irretrievably in love with an orphan girl who possessed nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart of incomparable beauty. The implications were staggering. To pursue Charlotte would mean breaking his engagement to Princess Amelia, defying the king, scandalizing society, and potentially destroying his family's standing. It was unthinkable, impossible, a betrayal of everything he had been raised to value. Yet as he stood in the cold chapel of St. Cuthbert's, watching Charlotte comfort a weeping widow, he knew with absolute certainty that he could not marry Amelia. He could not condemn himself to a lifetime of hollow formality, not when he had tasted, however briefly, the possibility of genuine connection. He could not stand before God and vow to honor a woman he did not love, not when his heart belonged entirely to another. The decision once made brought a strange sense of peace. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with difficulty, that he would face condemnation and ridicule, that his actions might bring ruin upon his house. But for the first time in his life, Alexander Pembroke chose love over duty, heart over obligation, truth over pretense. The scandal erupted with the force of a summer storm. Alexander requested a private audience with Princess Amelia, and with as much gentleness as he could muster, informed her that he could not proceed with their marriage. Amelia, to her credit, received the news with icy composure. She did not weep or plead or rage. She simply stared at him with eyes as cold as winter frost and asked a single question. "Is there another?" Alexander, bound by honor to speak truth, admitted there was. Amelia rose from her chair with regal dignity, gathered her skirts, and delivered a parting blow that would echo through the halls of power. "You have chosen a path of disgrace, Your Grace. I hope she is worth the ruin you will bring upon yourself and all who bear your name." Then she swept from the room, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of his choice. The king's response was swift and savage. A letter arrived at Ashcombe Manor, sealed with the royal crest, its contents a masterpiece of controlled fury. Alexander was informed that his actions constituted a grave insult to the crown, a breach of trust that would not be forgotten. While the king could not compel him to marry against his will, he could and would ensure that Alexander faced the full consequences of his decision. Invitations to court were withdrawn, royal patronage revoked, and word spread through the highest circles that the Duke of Ashcombe had committed an act of unforgivable impudence. Society, always quick to turn on those who violated its sacred codes, descended upon Alexander with gleeful malice. He was cut from guest lists, snubbed at his club, subjected to vicious gossip that painted him as a madman, driven to folly by base lust. His own family, horrified by the scandal, sent representatives to plead with him to reconsider, to make amends, to salvage what remained of the Pembroke reputation. Alexander refused every entreaty, his resolve hardening with each attempt to sway him. Through it all, Charlotte remained unaware of the tempest she had unwittingly caused. She continued her work at St. Cuthbert's, ignorant of the fact that her existence had upended the lives of princes and dukes. Alexander had not yet spoken to her of his feelings, fearing that his attentions might bring her harm. But he could not stay away. Even as London society turned against him, even as his world crumbled around him, he returned to the parish, drawn by a force he could neither resist nor fully comprehend. It was on a grey November afternoon, as the first snow began to fall, that he finally confessed the truth. He found Charlotte in the chapel, arranging wildflowers on the altar, her movements graceful and unhurried. He approached slowly, his heart pounding with an intensity he had never before experienced. "Miss Hale," he began, his voice rough with emotion. Charlotte turned, surprise flickering across her delicate features. She curtsied as protocol demanded, though the gesture seemed absurd in that humble setting. "Your Grace," she murmured, confusion evident in her tone. "I did not expect to see you today. Is there something you require for the parish?" Alexander shook his head, struggling to find words adequate to convey the magnitude of what he felt. "I require nothing for the parish, Miss Hale. I have come to speak with you about a matter of great importance." Charlotte's eyes widened, a faint blush coloring her pale cheeks. "I cannot imagine what matter could be of importance between us, Your Grace. We are of such different stations." "That is precisely what I wish to discuss," Alexander said, stepping closer. "Station, and the utter irrelevance of it when measured against matters of the heart." He saw her tense, saw wariness replace confusion, and he pressed on before courage could fail him. "I have broken my engagement to Princess Amelia. The entire kingdom speaks of nothing else, and I am now the subject of scandal and derision. I have lost the king's favor, alienated my family, and become a pariah in society. And I have done all of this gladly, willingly, because I could not marry one woman when my heart belongs to another." Charlotte's breath caught, her hand flying to her throat. "Your Grace, you cannot mean—" "I mean every word, Charlotte," Alexander interrupted, using her given name for the first time, savoring its sweetness on his tongue. "I have fallen in love with you. I do not know when it happened or how, only that it is as true and undeniable as the air I breathe. I know I have no right to speak to you thus, that my attentions may be unwelcome, that you may think me a madman driven to folly. But I could not proceed without telling you the truth, without offering you my heart and my name if you will have them." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Charlotte stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face pale as snow. Then, to Alexander's horror, tears began to stream down her cheeks. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You are a duke, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in England. I am nothing, no one, an orphan with no family, no dowry, no standing. You would be ruined entirely if you were to marry me. Society would never accept it. Your family would disown you. The king would consider it a final, unforgivable insult." Alexander reached for her hands, capturing them in his own despite her attempt to pull away. "I care nothing for society's opinion, Charlotte. I care nothing for titles or fortunes or the favor of kings. I care only for you, for the goodness I see in your heart, for the strength I witness in your every action, for the beauty that radiates from your very soul. You are not nothing. You are everything. And if loving you means losing all else, then I count it a price worth paying." Charlotte shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "You do not understand what you are saying. You have lived your entire life in comfort and privilege. You cannot fathom what it means to be truly poor, to be scorned and dismissed, to have doors closed in your face simply because of your birth. If you marry me, that will become your reality. You will be cast out, rejected, forced to live on the margins of the world you have always known. I cannot allow you to make such a sacrifice for my sake." Alexander pulled her closer, his grip gentle but unyielding. "It is not a sacrifice, Charlotte. It is a liberation. I have spent my life in a gilded cage, bound by expectations and obligations that have nothing to do with who I truly am. You have shown me what it means to live with purpose, to act with compassion, to value substance over appearance. Marrying you would not be a descent into poverty, but an ascent into richness of a kind I have never known. Please, Charlotte, do not refuse me out of fear of what others will think or say. Tell me what your heart desires. Can you love me even a little? Is there any hope that you might one day return the feelings I have confessed?" Charlotte looked up at him, and in her eyes Alexander saw a reflection of his own longing, his own desperate hope. "I have loved you from the moment you first spoke to me with kindness," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I thought it a foolish dream, a fantasy that could never be realized. I never imagined you might feel the same, never dared to hope that someone like you could see anything of value in someone like me. But if you truly mean what you say, if you are willing to face the consequences, then yes, Alexander, I will marry you. I will stand beside you through whatever storms may come, and I will love you with every breath I take until my last day on this earth." Alexander felt something break open inside him, a dam of emotion held in check for far too long finally giving way. He pulled Charlotte into his arms, holding her as though she might vanish if he loosened his grip, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he allowed himself to feel the full weight and wonder of love. They stood together in that humble chapel, an orphan and a duke, two souls who should never have met but who had found in each other a completeness neither had known existed. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the soot-stained streets in white, transforming ugliness into beauty, and Alexander knew with absolute certainty that whatever lay ahead, he would face it gladly, so long as Charlotte was by his side. The weeks following Alexander's proposal to Charlotte were marked by a ferocity of opposition that even he, prepared as he thought himself for resistance, had not fully anticipated. News of the engagement spread through London with the speed of wildfire, igniting outrage, shock, and gleeful scandal in equal measure. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensational stories, seized upon the tale with relish, publishing lurid accounts that painted Alexander as a fool bewitched by a scheming pauper, and Charlotte as a cunning opportunist who had ensnared a duke through manipulation and wiles. Neither portrayal bore any resemblance to truth, but truth was a commodity of little value in the marketplace of gossip. What mattered was spectacle, and the union of a duke and an orphan provided spectacle in abundance. Alexander's family descended upon Ashcombe Manor like a flock of carrion birds, determined to talk sense into the wayward duke before irreparable damage was done. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived first, her carriage clattering up the gravel drive with an urgency that sent servants scattering. She was a woman of formidable presence, tall and angular, with silver hair arranged in elaborate coils and eyes that could freeze water at 20 paces. Alexander received her in the library, bracing himself for the onslaught he knew would come. The dowager did not disappoint. She launched into a tirade that ranged from appeals to family honor to predictions of financial ruin, her voice rising with each successive argument. "You are destroying everything your father built," she declared, her hands trembling with fury. "The Pembroke name has stood for centuries as a symbol of excellence, of nobility in both title and character. And you would throw it all away for a girl plucked from the gutters of London? Have you lost your senses entirely?" Alexander listened in silence until his mother's fury had spent itself, then responded with a calmness that only seemed to inflame her further. "I have not lost my senses, Mother. I have found them. For the first time in my life, I am making a choice based on what I believe to be right, rather than what is expected or convenient. Charlotte Hale is a woman of extraordinary character, and I consider myself fortunate beyond measure that she has agreed to be my wife. I understand your concerns, and I regret the distress my decision has caused you, but I will not be swayed. The matter is settled." The dowager stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue, then rose from her chair with a rustle of silk. "Then you leave me no choice," she said coldly. "I wash my hands of you, Alexander. When you come to your senses and realize the magnitude of your folly, do not expect forgiveness or assistance from this family. You have made your choice, and you will live with the consequences alone." She swept from the room, leaving Alexander to grapple with the bitter ache of familial rejection. His younger brother, Lord Edmund Pembroke, arrived the following day with a different approach. Where their mother had attacked with fury, Edmund employed reason and persuasion. He was a genial man, well-liked in society, with a talent for diplomacy that had earned him positions in various governmental capacities. He took Alexander aside, poured 2 glasses of brandy, and settled into a chair with the air of one preparing for a lengthy conversation. "I will not insult you by suggesting you do not know your own heart, Alexander," Edmund began, his tone measured and respectful. "I believe you when you say you love this girl. But love, while a noble sentiment, is not always sufficient foundation for a marriage, particularly when that marriage will be subjected to the kind of scrutiny and hostility you will undoubtedly face. Have you considered what life will be like for Charlotte? She will be thrust into a world for which she has no preparation, subjected to cruelty and derision from women who resent her presence, isolated from the society that should welcome her. Can you truly claim to love her if you are willing to subject her to such an ordeal?" It was a shrewd argument, one that struck at Alexander's deepest fears. He had indeed worried about Charlotte's ability to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, had lain awake at night imagining the slights and humiliations she would endure. But he had also witnessed her strength, her resilience, her capacity to endure hardship with grace. "Charlotte is stronger than you give her credit for," Alexander replied. "She has survived poverty, loss, and deprivation that would break most of the pampered women of our acquaintance. She does not need society's approval to know her own worth, nor does she require validation from those who judge her solely on her birth. I have faith in her ability to withstand whatever challenges lie ahead, and I will stand beside her every step of the way." Edmund sighed, swirling the brandy in his glass. "I hope you are right, brother. For both your sakes, I truly hope you are right. But do not say you were not warned of the difficulties ahead." The hostility Alexander faced from his own family was mirrored, and indeed exceeded, by the response of society at large. Invitations that had once flooded Ashcombe Manor ceased entirely. Former friends crossed the street to avoid acknowledging him. His club, where he had been a member for over a decade, quietly suggested he might wish to resign to spare himself the embarrassment of formal expulsion. The king, still smarting from the insult of the broken engagement, made his displeasure known through official channels, withdrawing certain privileges and honours that had long been associated with the Pembroke title. Through it all, Alexander held firm, his resolve strengthened rather than weakened by opposition. He had expected resistance, had known that choosing Charlotte would cost him dearly. What he had not anticipated was the depth of satisfaction he would feel in that choice, the sense of rightness that accompanied every decision made from the heart rather than from obligation. Charlotte, for her part, struggled with the sudden and dramatic change in her circumstances. Alexander had insisted she leave St. Cuthbert's parish and take up residence at Ashcombe Manor until their wedding, both to protect her from the sordid attention of the press and to allow her time to prepare for her new role. She arrived at the manor with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing a few cherished possessions, a worn prayer book that had belonged to her mother, a faded ribbon she had found as a child and treasured ever since, and a sketch of St. Cuthbert's chapel drawn by one of the orphans she had cared for. The grandeur of Ashcombe overwhelmed her. She had never seen so much space devoted to a single family, never imagined that rooms could be so vast, ceilings so high, furnishings so exquisite. She wandered the corridors like a ghost, terrified of touching anything lest she damage some priceless heirloom, acutely conscious of her own inadequacy in such surroundings. Alexander did everything in his power to ease her transition, assigning her a kind and patient lady's maid, ensuring she was provided with appropriate clothing, arranging for tutors to instruct her in the social graces she would need to navigate her new world. But the gulf between Charlotte's upbringing and the life she was now expected to lead seemed at times insurmountable. She struggled with the simplest tasks: how to dress for different occasions, how to engage in the trivial conversations that dominated social interactions, how to use the bewildering array of silverware presented at formal dinners. She made mistakes, many of them, and each error brought a fresh wave of shame and self-doubt. There were moments when she questioned whether she had made the right choice, whether her love for Alexander was worth the pain of feeling perpetually out of place, perpetually inadequate. It was during one such moment of crisis that Alexander found her weeping in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants that seemed to mock her with their foreign beauty. He sat beside her on the marble bench, taking her hands in his, and waited until her tears had subsided before speaking. "I know this is difficult for you, Charlotte," he said gently. "I know you feel lost and overwhelmed, and I wish I could spare you this struggle. But please, do not doubt yourself, or us. You are not inadequate. You are learning to navigate a world that is absurd and superficial, a world that values appearance over substance, lineage over character. The fact that you find it difficult only proves that you have more sense and integrity than most of the people who were born into it. I do not need you to become someone you are not. I fell in love with you exactly as you are, and that is who I want you to remain." Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes red from crying, her voice trembling. "But what if I cannot do this, Alexander? What if I fail you, embarrass you, prove myself unworthy of the faith you have placed in me?" Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely tender. "You could never fail me, Charlotte. You have already given me more than I ever dreamed of having. Your love, your trust, your willingness to take this leap with me, despite all the risks. Everything else is mere detail, inconsequential compared to what we share. We will face this together, and we will find our way, I promise you." His words, spoken with such conviction, restored something of Charlotte's courage. She leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his presence, and resolved to try harder, not for society's sake, but for his. As winter deepened and the wedding date approached, Alexander and Charlotte began to find a rhythm together. In the evenings, after lessons and obligations were completed, they would meet in the library, where Alexander would read aloud from books of poetry and philosophy, while Charlotte worked on her embroidery, a skill she was slowly mastering under the patient tutelage of her maid. They spoke of their hopes for the future, of the life they would build together, of the charitable works they would undertake once married. Alexander shared his vision of transforming Ashcombe into a place of refuge and opportunity for those in need, of using his wealth and position to effect meaningful change rather than simply maintaining the status quo. Charlotte listened with shining eyes, her own dreams of helping others merging seamlessly with his. In those quiet hours, removed from the judgment and hostility of the outside world, they found sanctuary in each other's company, their bond deepening with each passing day. Yet even as their private happiness grew, the public campaign against their union intensified. Princess Amelia, humiliated by the very public rejection, threw her considerable influence behind efforts to ostracize Alexander and Charlotte. She spread rumors that Charlotte was not merely an orphan, but the illegitimate daughter of a prostitute, that she had bewitched Alexander through dark arts, that she was after nothing but his money and title. None of these accusations bore even a grain of truth, but repetition lent them the veneer of credibility. Society matrons who had once fawned over Alexander now refused to acknowledge him, their daughters instructed to avert their eyes if they happened to encounter him in public. The scandal sheets published vicious cartoons depicting Alexander as a lovesick fool led by the nose by a scheming harlot, images that were crude, cruel, and wildly popular. Through it all, Alexander remained steadfast, but Charlotte felt the weight of every insult, every lie, every contemptuous glance. She began to withdraw into herself, speaking less, smiling rarely, her spirit dimmed by the relentless assault on her character. Alexander noticed, of course, and it tore at his heart to see her suffering. He confronted her one evening as they sat together in the drawing room, firelight casting dancing shadows across her pale face. "Charlotte, you must not allow these vicious lies to wound you," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "The people spreading them are small-minded and cruel, their opinions worth less than nothing. You know the truth of who you are, and so do I. That is all that matters." Charlotte shook her head, her expression haunted. "But it is not all that matters, Alexander. These people, as small-minded as they may be, constitute the world you were born into, the world you would have continued to inhabit had you not met me. And now, because of me, you are an outcast, reviled and rejected by everyone you have ever known. How can I not feel responsible for your suffering? How can I not wonder if you would have been better off had we never met?" Alexander rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her, so that their eyes were level. "Listen to me, Charlotte, and believe what I tell you. I would not be better off. I would be trapped in a loveless marriage to a woman I neither knew nor cared for, living a life of hollow ritual and empty obligation. You have given me freedom, purpose, love. You have awakened parts of myself I did not know existed. If the price of that awakening is the loss of society's approval, then I pay it gladly, without a moment's regret. Please, do not doubt us. Do not let their poison seep into your heart." His words, fervent and heartfelt, broke through Charlotte's despair. She reached for him, pulling him up onto the settee beside her, and they sat together in silence, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped protectively around her. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the world in white, muffling sound, creating an island of peace in the midst of chaos. They drew strength from each other, their love a bulwark against the storm raging beyond the walls of Ashcombe Manor. And in that moment, Charlotte made a silent vow. She would not allow fear or doubt to drive her away from this man who had risked everything for her. She would stand beside him, face whatever trials lay ahead, and prove to herself and to the world that love, true love, was worth any sacrifice. The turning point came in early February, just weeks before the planned wedding. Alexander received an unexpected visitor, Lord Hastings, an old friend from his university days who had maintained a careful distance since the scandal broke. Hastings was a jovial man, round-faced and good-natured, with a reputation for fairness and loyalty. He arrived unannounced, brushing past the butler with cheerful disregard for protocol, and found Alexander in his study, reviewing accounts. "Ashcombe, old friend," Hastings declared, settling himself into a chair without invitation. "I owe you an apology. I have behaved abominably these past months, allowing fear of association to override friendship. I am ashamed of myself, and I have come to make amends." Alexander looked up, surprised and cautiously hopeful. "Hastings, I confess, I did not expect to see you here." Hastings waved a dismissive hand. "Yes, well, I am not proud of my absence, but I have been doing some thinking, and I have come to a conclusion. This business of ostracizing you for marrying the woman you love is absolute nonsense. I have made inquiries about Miss Hale, discreet inquiries, mind you, and everything I have learned speaks to her character and virtue. The rumors circulating about her are malicious fabrications, spread by those with petty grievances and small hearts. You have chosen well, Ashcombe, and any man with sense can see that. Society be damned." I intend to attend your wedding, and I intend to make it known that I support your choice. Furthermore, I shall use what influence I possess to encourage others to do the same." Alexander felt a surge of gratitude, so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. "Hastings, I cannot adequately express what your support means to me. Charlotte and I have felt isolated these past months, surrounded by hostility on all sides. To know that we have at least one ally in this gives me more hope than you can imagine." Hastings grinned. "Oh, you shall have more than one ally, my friend. I am not without influence, and I intend to use it. There are others who share my view, who believe this persecution has gone too far. We shall organize, make our voices heard, and show society that there are still those who value integrity over conformity." True to his word, Hastings set about rallying support for Alexander and Charlotte. He hosted a dinner party at his London townhouse, to which he invited carefully selected guests, all of whom were known for independent thinking and progressive views. At this gathering, he made an impassioned speech about the virtues of marrying for love rather than advantage, about the courage required to defy convention in pursuit of happiness, about the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to value virtue while condemning a woman of impeccable character simply because she lacked a title. His words struck a chord with many present, and by the end of the evening, several influential figures had pledged their support for the Ashcombe wedding. Word of Hastings' efforts spread, creating a rift within society itself. Where there had previously been near-unanimous condemnation of Alexander's choice, there now emerged a faction, small but vocal, that defended it. Debate raged in drawing rooms and clubs across London. Was the Duke of Ashcombe a fool or a romantic hero? Was Charlotte Hale a fortune hunter, or a woman of uncommon virtue? The very existence of such debate represented a shift, a crack in the monolith of opposition that had seemed so impenetrable. Alexander and Charlotte, informed of these developments by Lord Hastings during one of his increasingly frequent visits to Ashcombe Manor, felt the first stirrings of genuine hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, they would not have to face their future entirely alone. Perhaps there were those who valued love and integrity above rigid adherence to class distinctions. Perhaps their marriage would not only survive the scandal, but might even serve as a catalyst for broader change in how society viewed such unions. As the wedding day drew near, preparations intensified. Charlotte, with the assistance of a seamstress brought in from London, designed her wedding gown, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk, free from the excessive ornamentation favored by fashionable brides. She wanted something that reflected her own taste and character, something that would feel authentic rather than costume-like. Alexander arranged for the ceremony to be held in the chapel at Ashcombe Manor, a small, ancient building that had served the Pembroke family for generations. He wanted the wedding to be intimate, attended only by those who genuinely supported their union, free from the prying eyes and cruel whispers of hostile observers. Invitations were sent to a carefully curated list: Lord Hastings and his wife, a handful of Alexander's relatives who had quietly expressed support, the parish priest from St. Cuthbert's who had known Charlotte since childhood, and a few trusted servants from Ashcombe who had come to respect and care for Charlotte during her time at the manor. The night before the wedding, Charlotte could not sleep. She stood at the window of her chamber, looking out over the snow-covered grounds of Ashcombe, her mind a tumult of emotions. Tomorrow, she would become the Duchess of Ashcombe, a title that seemed utterly incongruous with everything she had been and known. She thought of the children she had left behind at St. Cuthbert's, wondered how they were faring, promised herself that she would use her new position to help them in ways she never could before. She thought of her mother, dead before Charlotte had even drawn her first breath, and wondered what she would think of this extraordinary turn her daughter's life had taken. She thought of Alexander, sleeping in his own chamber just down the corridor, and felt a wave of love so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with him, and that knowledge gave her courage. Morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Charlotte was awakened by her maid, who brought breakfast and then helped her bathe and dress. The wedding gown fit perfectly, its simple lines flattering without being ostentatious. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, woven through with tiny white flowers, and a delicate veil of Brussels lace completed the ensemble. When Charlotte looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked for the first time in her life like someone who belonged in this world of beauty and refinement. Yet beneath the finery, she was still Charlotte Hale, orphan girl from St. Cuthbert's Parish, and she knew she must never forget that. Her past was part of who she was, and she would carry it with her always, a reminder of where she had come from and why compassion mattered. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. Alexander stood at the altar in the small chapel, his eyes never leaving Charlotte as she walked toward him down the narrow aisle. There were no crowds, no pomp, no elaborate displays, just two people promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives, surrounded by a small group of witnesses who genuinely wished them well. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander kissed Charlotte for the first time as her lawful spouse, there was not a dry eye in the chapel. Even Lord Hastings, not generally prone to sentimentality, was seen dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. A modest wedding breakfast followed, with toasts and laughter, and a sense of warmth that had been absent from Ashcombe Manor for far too long. And as Charlotte sat beside her new husband, his hand clasping hers beneath the table, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps against all odds they would find happiness together. The battle was far from over, but they had won the first and most important victory. They had chosen each other, and no force on earth could undo that choice. The months following Alexander and Charlotte's wedding unfolded in a pattern of quiet defiance and gradual transformation. The newlyweds remained at Ashcombe Manor, deliberately avoiding London and the society that had shown them such contempt. Alexander threw himself into managing his estates with a rigor and attention to detail he had never before demonstrated, discovering in the process a genuine aptitude for stewardship that had lain dormant during his years of idle privilege. Charlotte, for her part, began to find her footing as Duchess of Ashcombe, a role she redefined according to her own values rather than the expectations of others. Together, they developed a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and deepening love, creating a life that, while unconventional, brought them both profound satisfaction. One of Charlotte's first acts as Duchess was to establish a charitable foundation dedicated to improving conditions for orphans and impoverished children throughout the region. She persuaded Alexander to set aside a substantial portion of his income for this purpose, and he agreed without hesitation, moved by her passion and commitment. The foundation opened schools where children could learn to read and write, provided medical care to those who could not afford physicians, distributed food and clothing to families on the brink of starvation. Charlotte herself was intimately involved in every aspect of the work, visiting schools and hospitals, meeting with families, ensuring that funds were used effectively and compassionately. The people of the surrounding counties, many of whom had initially viewed the Ashcombe scandal with disapproval, gradually came to respect and admire the young Duchess, whose actions demonstrated genuine concern for their welfare. Word of Charlotte's charitable work began to spread beyond the immediate vicinity of Ashcombe, carried by travellers and tradesmen, by clergy and physicians, by all those whose lives she had touched. Stories circulated of the orphan-turned-duchess who had not forgotten her humble origins, who used her elevated position to lift up those still suffering in poverty. The contrast between these accounts and the vicious rumors that had dominated the scandal sheets became increasingly difficult to ignore. A few brave souls among the gentry and minor nobility began to question whether society had been too hasty in its condemnation of the Ashcombe marriage. Perhaps, they ventured cautiously, there was more to Charlotte Pembroke than the caricature painted by her enemies. Perhaps the Duke had shown wisdom rather than folly in choosing a woman of character over a woman of title. This shift in perception was gradual and far from universal. There remained many, particularly among the highest echelons of society, who viewed any acceptance of Charlotte as an intolerable erosion of class boundaries. Princess Amelia, now married to a minor European prince in a union arranged hastily to salvage her dignity, continued to nurse her wounded pride and encouraged her supporters to maintain their hostility toward the Pembrokes. Yet the unanimity of opposition that had once seemed absolute began to fracture, creating space for alternate viewpoints to emerge. Lord Hastings, who had appointed himself unofficial champion of the Ashcombe cause, seized upon this opening, writing letters to influential friends, hosting gatherings where Charlotte's accomplishments were discussed in admiring terms, slowly but persistently chipping away at the wall of prejudice that surrounded her. Spring came to Ashcombe with an explosion of colour and life. The gardens, long neglected during the previous Duke's final years, burst into bloom under the attentive care of gardeners who responded to Charlotte's gentle encouragement and genuine appreciation of their work. She walked the grounds daily, often accompanied by Alexander, the two of them discussing plans for improvements to the estate and the charitable foundation. Their conversations ranged widely, touching on philosophy, politics, literature, all the subjects Charlotte had once believed beyond her reach. Alexander delighted in her quick intelligence, her fresh perspective unburdened by the cynicism that afflicted so many of his class. She challenged his assumptions, asked questions that forced him to examine beliefs he had long taken for granted, and in the process helped him become a better, more thoughtful man. Their marriage, which society had predicted would crumble under the weight of its own impropriety, grew stronger with each passing day. It was during this period of burgeoning happiness that an unexpected letter arrived at Ashcombe Manor, bearing the royal seal. Alexander opened it with trepidation, fearing some new expression of displeasure from the king, some additional punishment for his defiance. Instead, he found a terse but not unfriendly communication requesting his presence at court for a private audience. No explanation was given for the summons, and Alexander was left to speculate on its purpose. He discussed the matter with Charlotte, who urged him to accept the invitation despite the risk it might entail. "You cannot hide from the king forever, Alexander," she said reasonably. "Whatever he wishes to say, it is better to hear it directly than to live in uncertainty. And perhaps if the stories of my charitable work have reached even royal ears, His Majesty may be prepared to view our marriage with less hostility than before." Alexander was less optimistic, but he recognized the wisdom in Charlotte's counsel. He wrote to accept the invitation and prepared for the journey to London, the first he would make since his self-imposed exile from the city. Charlotte insisted on accompanying him, despite his concerns for her comfort and safety. "I am your wife, Alexander," she said firmly. "My place is beside you in adversity as in prosperity. We shall face the king together." Her courage humbled him, and he agreed, though he made arrangements to keep their visit brief and discreet, lodging at the Pembroke townhouse in Mayfair rather than accepting any social invitations. The audience with the king took place in a small private chamber at St. James's Palace. Alexander and Charlotte were kept waiting for what felt like an eternity before being ushered into the royal presence. King George IV, now in the twilight of his reign and suffering from the various ailments that would soon claim his life, sat in an ornate chair, his bulk draped in elaborate robes, his face bearing the marks of dissipation and declining health. He regarded Alexander and Charlotte with rheumy eyes, his expression unreadable, before gesturing for them to approach. "To your grace," the king said, his voice carrying the raspy quality of one who had lived too long and too extravagantly. "You have caused us considerable displeasure with your unconventional choices. The breaking of an engagement to a royal princess is not a matter to be taken lightly." Alexander bowed, his jaw tight. "I am aware of the offense I gave, Your Majesty, and I regret any embarrassment caused to Princess Amelia or to the crown. However, I cannot and will not apologize for marrying the woman I love." The king's eyebrows rose, and for a moment Alexander feared he had overstepped fatally. Then, to his astonishment, the king laughed, a wheezing sound that ended in a fit of coughing. "Love," the king repeated when he had recovered his breath. "An inconvenient sentiment for a man of your station, but not without its appeal. We ourselves have known the complications that arise when the heart makes demands the position cannot easily accommodate." He turned his attention to Charlotte, who stood beside Alexander with quiet dignity, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze respectfully lowered. "So this is the woman who caused such an uproar. Look at us, girl." Charlotte raised her eyes to meet the king's, and Alexander felt a surge of pride at the calm composure she displayed in the face of royal scrutiny. "You are very young," the king observed, And certainly comely enough, though we must confess we do not see the sorcery that so many claimed you employed to entrap the Duke." A faint smile touched Charlotte's lips. "There was no sorcery, Your Majesty, only mutual regard and affection which grew over time into love." The king studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We have heard reports of your charitable endeavors, Duchess. They speak well of your character, and suggest that perhaps those who condemned you so swiftly may have been somewhat precipitate in their judgment." Alexander felt a flicker of hope, carefully suppressed lest it prove premature. "Your Majesty is most gracious to say so," he said. "Charlotte has indeed devoted herself to works of charity, using her position to help those most in need. It is one of the many reasons I am proud to call her my wife." The king waved a bejeweled hand. Yes, very commendable. The truth is, Ashcombe, we find ourselves in a somewhat awkward position. Princess Amelia has married elsewhere and is no longer our concern. The scandal, while titillating, has begun to bore even the most dedicated gossips, and we have received a number of petitions from various quarters suggesting that continued royal disfavor toward you serves no useful purpose and may in fact be seen as petty vindictiveness on our part. We are not fond of being perceived as petty. Alexander barely dared to breathe. "What are you saying, Your Majesty?" The king shifted in his chair, grimacing with discomfort. "We are saying, Ashcombe, that we are prepared to extend a qualified forgiveness. You will not be restored to your former position at court. That would be too much too soon, but neither will you continue to labor under our active displeasure. You may appear at such functions as do not involve the royal family directly, and we shall not object. In time, should you and your Duchess continue to conduct yourselves with the propriety you have recently demonstrated, full reconciliation may be possible. Does that satisfy you?" It was more than Alexander had dared hope for. "It does indeed, Your Majesty. We are most grateful for your clemency and your willingness to reconsider your initial judgment." The king made a dismissive gesture. "Do not thank us too profusely. We are doing this as much for our own sake as for yours. A king must occasionally demonstrate magnanimity, particularly when his own position is, shall we say, less secure than it once was. Now go, both of you, before we change our mind and decide this was all a terrible idea." Alexander and Charlotte made their farewells and withdrew from the royal presence, neither daring to speak until they were safely ensconced in their carriage and on their way back to the Mayfair townhouse. Then Charlotte turned to Alexander, her eyes shining with tears of relief and joy. "Do you realize what this means? We are no longer outcasts. We can begin to rebuild what was lost." Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We have already built something far more valuable than what was lost, Charlotte. We have built a life based on love and shared purpose, and no amount of royal favor can improve upon that. But yes, I am glad that the worst of the hostility has passed, glad that you will no longer have to endure the cruelty that has been directed at you. You deserve acceptance, respect, admiration, and now perhaps you will begin to receive what you have always deserved." They spent 3 more days in London, during which word of the king's change of heart spread rapidly through society. Invitations began to arrive at the Pembroke townhouse, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. Charlotte and Alexander attended a select few gatherings, carefully chosen to minimize potential unpleasantness. The reception they received was mixed. Some guests remained coldly disapproving, others were warmly welcoming. Most fell somewhere in between, treating the Pembrokes with polite neutrality that allowed for future thawing without requiring immediate embrace. Charlotte comported herself with a grace that surprised even Alexander, who had always believed in her capacity for greatness. She spoke when spoken to, listened attentively to the conversation of others, deflected insulting questions with quiet dignity, and made no attempt to pretend she was anything other than what she was. Those who approached her with genuine kindness found her warm and engaging. Those who sought to patronize or humiliate found her politely untouchable. By the end of their brief sojourn in London, even some of Charlotte's harshest critics were forced to admit that the Duchess of Ashcombe was a woman of considerable poise and intelligence, whatever the irregularity of her origins. The true test of society's changing attitude came in early summer, when Lady Hastings organized a grand ball at the Hastings estate, and extended a personal invitation to Alexander and Charlotte. It would be Charlotte's first appearance at a major society event, and both she and Alexander understood that how she was received would likely determine the trajectory of their social rehabilitation. Charlotte spent weeks preparing, working with her tutors to polish her dancing, her conversation, her understanding of the complex social codes that governed such gatherings. Alexander watched her dedication with a mixture of admiration and guilt, hating that she had to work so hard to earn acceptance that should have been freely given, yet proud beyond measure of her determination to succeed. The night of the ball, Charlotte wore a gown of sapphire blue silk that brought out the depth of her dark eyes and complemented the simple strand of pearls Alexander had given her as a wedding gift. Her hair was arranged in an elegant coiffure that showcased her graceful neck, and she carried herself with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of hard-won self-assurance. Alexander, watching her descend the stairs of the Pembroke townhouse, felt his breath catch. She was quite simply magnificent, and he knew beyond doubt that every person at that ball would see what he had known from the beginning, that Charlotte Pembroke was worthy of her title in every way that mattered. They arrived at the Hastings estate to find carriages lined up along the drive, torches blazing in the gathering dusk, music drifting from the brightly lit windows of the grand ballroom. Alexander felt Charlotte's hand tighten on his arm as they approached the entrance, and he covered it with his own, offering silent reassurance. They were announced at the door, and for one terrible moment, conversation in the ballroom ceased entirely. Every eye turned toward them, assessing, judging, measuring. Charlotte lifted her chin, met those stares with quiet dignity, and something remarkable happened. Lady Hastings herself crossed the floor to greet them, taking Charlotte's hands in hers with genuine warmth. "My dear Duchess," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "how delighted we are to have you here. Come, you must meet everyone properly." What followed was a triumph beyond Alexander's wildest hopes. Charlotte moved through the gathering with grace and intelligence, conversing easily with those who approached her, deflecting subtle hostility with tactful responses, charming even some of her harshest critics with her evident sincerity and lack of pretension. She danced first with Alexander, then with Lord Hastings, then with a succession of gentlemen emboldened by the evident approval of their hosts. By the end of the evening, the whispered conversations had shifted from condemnation to grudging admiration. The Duchess of Ashcombe, society concluded, was not at all what they had been led to expect. She was no vulgar opportunist, but a woman of refinement, compassion, and genuine quality. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Duke had not been quite so foolish after all. The success of that evening marked a turning point. Invitations began to arrive at Ashcombe with regularity, and while Charlotte and Alexander continued to be selective about which events they attended, they were no longer social pariahs. Society had not forgotten the scandal of their marriage, but it had ceased to define them entirely. They were judged increasingly on their own merits: Alexander's improved stewardship of his estates, Charlotte's charitable work, the obvious depth of affection they bore for each other. The notion that marriages should be based on duty and advantage rather than love, while still dominant, began to face quiet challenge from those who saw in the Pembrokes an example of an alternate possibility. As autumn returned to Ashcombe, bringing with it the golden light and crisp air that Alexander had always loved, Charlotte discovered she was with child. The news filled both of them with joy, tempered by the awareness of how much rode on the safe delivery of an heir. Charlotte, practical as always, refused to be treated as an invalid, continuing her work with the charitable foundation well into her pregnancy, though she consented to reduce the physical demands of her schedule. Alexander hovered anxiously, driving her to distraction with his solicitude, until she finally had to order him with affectionate exasperation to occupy himself with estate business and leave her care to the capable midwife and physician he had engaged. The reconciliation with Alexander's family came gradually, initiated not by the Dowager Duchess, but by Lord Edmund, who had never entirely severed ties with his brother. Edmund visited Ashcombe in late autumn, ostensibly to discuss estate matters, but in reality to extend an olive branch. He found Charlotte in the nursery, overseeing preparations for the coming child, and was struck by the transformation in his brother, who seemed more animated, more genuinely happy than Edmund had ever seen him. Over dinner that evening, Edmund spoke with uncharacteristic emotion. "I owe you both an apology," he said. "I allowed fear and convention to blind me to what should have been obvious, that love and integrity matter more than lineage. Charlotte, you have made my brother happier than I believed possible, and you have done honor to our family name through your actions and character. I would be proud to call you sister, if you will forgive my initial coldness." Charlotte, moved to tears, assured him that forgiveness was freely given, and from that evening forward, Edmund became a staunch ally and friend. Through him, other members of the Pembroke family began to thaw, visiting Ashcombe, meeting Charlotte, discovering to their surprise that they genuinely liked the young woman who had caused such upheaval in their lives. Even the Dowager Duchess, her pride finally overcome by curiosity, and the desire to know her future grandchild, arrived one winter afternoon, stiff and formal at first, but gradually softening as she observed Charlotte's kindness, intelligence, and deep love for Alexander. By the time she departed 3 days later, she had extracted a promise that the child, if a boy, would be named after Alexander's late father, and she had given Charlotte a ring that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, a gesture of acceptance and welcome into the family. The child, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's strong features, arrived in early spring amidst daffodils and birdsong. Charlotte endured a long and difficult labor with remarkable courage, and when at last the infant was placed in her arms, both she and Alexander wept with relief and overwhelming love. They named her Eleanor, after Charlotte's mother, a choice that moved the attending physician who had known Charlotte since her days at St. Cuthbert's to unabashed tears. The christening held in the chapel at Ashcombe was attended by family, friends, and a significant number of the local gentry and nobility, all of whom had come to respect and admire the Duke and Duchess. It was a celebration not merely of a birth, but of the triumph of love over prejudice, of character over circumstance, of the possibility that the rigid hierarchies governing English society might, however slowly, yield to more compassionate and merit-based values. As years passed, Alexander and Charlotte built a life of purpose and meaning. The charitable foundation they had established expanded to encompass dozens of schools, hospitals, and relief programs throughout England, becoming a model for similar efforts by other enlightened members of the nobility. Their marriage, far from crumbling under the weight of scandal as so many had predicted, grew stronger with each passing season, a partnership of equals built on mutual respect, shared values, and enduring love. They had 3 more children, 2 sons and another daughter, each raised with the understanding that privilege entailed responsibility, that titles meant nothing without integrity, and that true nobility resided in how one treated the most vulnerable members of society. The story of their courtship and marriage became over time a legend of sorts, whispered about in drawing rooms and recounted in slightly embellished versions by those who claimed to have been present at key moments. Some still disapproved, clinging to the old ways and old prejudices, but they were increasingly voices of a fading past. The world was changing, slowly but inexorably, and the Pembrokes had played their small part in that change, proving through their example that love could indeed conquer even the most entrenched social barriers, and that a marriage built on genuine affection and shared purpose could endure and flourish in ways that arranged unions of convenience rarely did. I have told you this tale, dear listeners, not merely to recount a scandal that once shook the halls of power, but to remind you that courage takes many forms. Alexander Pembroke showed courage when he broke his royal engagement to follow his heart. Charlotte Hale showed courage when she accepted his proposal, despite knowing the hardships she would face. Together, they showed courage in building a life true to their values, rather than to the expectations of others. Their story is a testament to the transformative power of love, to the possibility of change even in the most rigid societies, and to the enduring truth that character, not birth, determines one's true worth. Epilogue. Years later. England, 1842. The years had not diminished the soft green of the Ashcombe Hills, nor the way the early light gathered in silver pools along the river that cut through the valley. Dawn lay over the estate like a benediction, quiet and sure, and from the eastern terrace of the manor, a figure stood watching it as one might watch an old beloved friend. Charlotte, Duchess of Ashcombe, drew her shawl closer against the slight chill and smiled as mist rose from the fields her husband had once ridden in reckless solitude. They were no longer the lands of a lonely duke and a burdened title. They were now the beating heart of a life purposefully lived. Behind her came the quick, uneven footsteps of youth. "Mama, you promised you would not go out alone before breakfast," Eleanor said, a little breathless as she stepped onto the terrace. At 13, the girl already carried herself with a curious blend of Charlotte's quiet assurance and Alexander's stubborn set of the jaw. "Papa will scold me first and you second if he finds you without a cloak." Charlotte laughed softly. "Your father has always preferred to scold himself before anyone else, my dear. Besides, when you are my age, you will find the morning air worth a mild reprimand." Eleanor joined her at the balustrade, resting slim hands upon the stone, her gaze following the gentle rise and fall of the land. "Reverend Hart says there was a time when no one from London would visit Ashcombe," she said. "He told us, after Sunday service, that some called it the fallen house, because of you and Papa." She darted Charlotte an apologetic look. "I told him they must have been very foolish people." "They were not so much foolish as afraid," Charlotte answered, the old hurt now no more than a faded ache. "Afraid of change, afraid of losing the rules that told them who was worthy and who was not. Fear makes people speak loudly, but it cannot keep hold of truth forever." "Is it true," Eleanor persisted, "that grandmother refused to see you when you first came here? Lady Hastings said that once, but Papa frowned at her and changed the subject." "It is true," Charlotte said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance. "She believed your father had disgraced his name. In her world, what we did was unthinkable. Yet here we stand, years later, and she has held each of her grandchildren in her arms." She smiled at the memory of the once implacable Dowager Duchess, her stern features softened by age and by the irresistible charm of small, grasping hands. "Time is a most patient teacher, Ellie. It persuades where argument fails." They stood in companionable silence until the estate began to stir awake below them. Stable boys leading horses from their stalls, kitchen maids opening shutters, smoke curling from chimneys. Somewhere a bell rang from the school Charlotte had insisted be built at the edge of the village, its stone walls now ivy-clad, its yard filled each day with the shouts and laughter of children who once would have had no future but the workhouse. Eleanor followed the sound with her eyes. "When I go to the school," she said slowly, "some of the girls look at me as if I am something very grand. They whisper, 'Your Grace,' and curtsy too low and run away giggling. I do not feel grand, only fortunate." She hesitated. "Nurse told me that once you were one of those girls, that you taught letters in a parish far worse than ours." Charlotte's fingers tightened briefly on the stone. "Nurse speaks more than is her place," she said, but there was no true reproof in it. "Yes, I once knelt on cold chapel floors and scrubbed them until my hands bled. I rose before dawn to fetch water and mend clothing and comfort children who had no one else to speak their names." She turned to her daughter, her gaze steady. "Do you know what that means for you, Eleanor?" The girl shook her head. "It means that every advantage you possess is borrowed, not owned. It is lent to you by birth and by circumstance, and you must spend it wisely. When the village girls look at you with wide eyes, remember that there is no intrinsic difference between you and them, only the road you were set upon at the start. Your task is not to feel guilty for your blessings, but to ensure that your life makes them worthwhile." Eleanor considered this with a seriousness that made Charlotte's heart ache with pride. "Like you did," she said at last. "Papa says you turned his title into a tool instead of a cage." "Your father gives me more credit than I am due," Charlotte replied, though privately she knew how fiercely she had fought to make that true. "We did it together. You will do the same in your own way." The terrace doors opened once more, this time admitting Alexander himself, his hair threaded with a distinguished silver that had done nothing to lessen the keen intelligence of his gaze. "There you both are," he said, affecting a gruffness that fooled neither wife nor daughter. "I might have known the day would begin with conspiracy." Merely instruction, Papa, Eleanor said, crossing to kiss his cheek. Mamma has been telling me that I must treat my advantages as borrowed and spend them wisely. An excellent summary, he said, slipping an arm around Charlotte's waist with the easy intimacy of long habit. I hope she also advised you to avoid dukes who make a habit of defying kings. They are more trouble than they are worth. Charlotte elbowed him lightly. On the contrary, I advised her that some dukes are worth any amount of trouble. He smiled down at her, and for a moment, the years between the misty chapel of St. Cuthbert's and this sunlit terrace collapsed into nothing. He still saw, in every line of her face, the woman who had knelt among the poor with wildflowers on a chipped altar, the woman whose compassion had undone him more thoroughly than any court intrigue could have done. Whatever the world had lost when he broke his royal engagement, he had gained a whole universe in return. Later that afternoon, the great hall of Ashcombe filled with visitors. Tenants come to present petitions, children from the village school bringing essays and clumsy drawings, a delegation from London eager to study the Ashcombe model of charitable administration. Charlotte moved among them with practiced ease, listening more than she spoke, making introductions, translating fear into understanding. Where once she had been the object of whispered judgment, she was now the axis around which these small worlds turned. In a quieter corner of the hall, a young woman stood twisting her bonnet ribbons between nervous fingers. Her dress was plain but neat, her eyes sharp with the wary defiance of one accustomed to being dismissed. Charlotte crossed to her at once. "You must be Miss Barton," she said warmly. "Reverend Hart writes very highly of your work with the village infirmary." The girl flushed. "I do what I can, Your Grace. It is not much." Charlotte recognized the self-effacing tone. She had once spoken with it herself. "What you can is often far more than you think," she answered. "Will you walk with me after we have done here? I should like to hear what obstacles you face and how Ashcombe might help remove them." As the girl nodded, hope flickering in her gaze, Alexander watched from across the room, pride settling over him like a well-worn cloak. There had been a time when men whispered that the Duchess of Ashcombe would be the ruin of them all. They whispered differently now. They spoke of new schools and reformed tenant laws, of hospitals built where there had once been only squalor, of a duke and duchess who sat at the same table as their tenants during harvest feasts and listened to complaints without offense. Not everyone approved, of course. There would always be those for whom change felt like a personal insult, but even they had learned that railing against Ashcombe accomplished little. The world, as it turned out, did not end when a duke married an orphan. That evening, long after visitors had departed and children been tucked into bed, Charlotte and Alexander returned once more to the terrace where the day had begun. The sky was ablaze with stars, the air scented with late roses, and the faintest tang of approaching autumn. "Do you ever miss it?" Charlotte asked quietly. "The world we left behind, the easy applause, the perfect obedience of rules you knew by heart?" Alexander considered the question. "I miss certain comforts, perhaps," he said. "The illusion that every door would always open at my touch. But I do not miss the man I was when I walked through those doors. He was admired, but he was not known. You changed that, Charlotte. You taught me that to be truly seen is both more terrifying and infinitely more worthwhile than being blindly praised." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you taught me," she replied, "that love given freely need not be returned with fear, that I might stand before kings and dowagers and still know my own worth." They fell silent, content in the knowledge that their story, once called a scandal, had become something gentler and far more enduring. A quiet legend, told in kitchens and classrooms, of a duke who chose an orphan and of an orphan who chose herself. The consequences of that choice rippled outward still, in the laughter from the village school, in the letters that arrived from distant parishes asking for guidance, in the steady, patient work of men and women who had taken courage from what Ashcombe had dared to do. Far off, a church bell tolled the late hour. Charlotte straightened, her hand finding Alexander's. "We should go in," she said. "Tomorrow will bring its own battles." "And its own joys," he answered. "We have been granted more of both than we ever expected." They turned back toward the house together, their silhouettes framed in the golden spill of candlelight from the open doors. Behind them, the estate lay quiet and secure, a testament not only to lineage and stone, but to the fierce, stubborn belief that love, once chosen, must be lived every day in 100 small acts of courage. And now, as we close this chapter of their remarkable journey, I have a small request for you, our dear listeners. If this tale of love, courage, and redemption has moved you, if it has brought you joy or given you hope, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Did Charlotte and Alexander's love story touch your heart? What would you have done in their place? And please, click that like button to let us know you enjoyed this journey through England's most scandalous romance. Don't forget to activate notifications so you'll be the first to know when we share our next tale of passion, intrigue, and happily ever after. Your support means the world to us, and it allows us to continue bringing you these stories of love conquering all. Until next time, dear listeners, may your own hearts be brave enough to choose love over convention, and may you find your own happily ever after, whatever form it may take. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story. The End.